My parents chose my golden brother's wedding over my treatment. Now they have nothing, and I watch it all crumble. My name is Jason, and I'm 27 years old. If my life were a movie, I'd probably be the guy in the background, barely noticeable, swallowed up by the shadows cast by the glaring spotlight that trailed my older brother, Nick. Nick, the golden boy, the one whose name our parents said with such pride that it sounded like a hymn. He was the epitome of everything parents wished for. Effortlessly charismatic, charming, the kind of athlete who racked up trophies like they were casual souvenirs. The whole package, as the moms at the park would gush, their eyes wide with admiration. And me? I was the other one, the second act that barely got mentioned, the afterthought. Oh, and Jason did well too. A sentence tacked on like an obligatory footnote. It wasn't that I resented Nick. Not always, anyway. Maybe just enough to fuel a quiet, constant ache. My role had always been to applaud from the sidelines as he soaked in every ounce of attention. When he aced a school competition, there would be a celebration complete with a cake that shouted, "You're the best, Nick!" in bright frosting. But when I came home with a science fair trophy, Mom would manage a distracted smile and say, "Oh, that's nice. How's it going with friends? Still none?" The real sting came when my life skidded into the hardest chapter I'd ever faced. It started innocuously enough, a routine doctor's appointment that I almost cancelled, thinking it wasn't worth the effort. The doctor looked at me over the rim of his glasses, the kind of stare that stretched seconds into eternities. His words hit like a gut punch. "Jason, we've got a serious problem. If I had $1 for every time life decided to drop an anvil on my head, I'd have a mansion by now." The diagnosis was grim, a medical storm I couldn't outrun, and the cost of treatment was more than just steep. It was laughably out of reach, the kind of bill that would make a wallet burst into flames out of sheer horror. In moments like these, most people would instinctively reach for their family like a drowning man clutching for a life preserver. And for a fleeting second, I thought that's exactly what I'd get, a lifeline. But reality, cold and unsparing, had other plans. The choice my parents faced should have been simple, their son's life or an extravagant wedding. But they were already halfway through rehearsing their roles, and the show had to go on. My mother, eyes glittering with excitement, said, "Jason, you understand, don't you? This is Nick's wedding. It's a once-in-a-lifetime event." Right, because my life, my future, couldn't possibly compare to the grandeur of a 200-guest celebration, complete with toasts, dance floors, and centerpieces that probably cost more than my rent. Nick's wedding became the gospel in our house, the only subject anyone talked about. There were endless calls with wedding planners, cake tastings where I sat silently, suit fittings where Nick stood, radiant in front of mirrors while I watched from the side, a ghost at a feast. And me? I was left to sit with my own festering thoughts, the bitterness swelling inside like an unwanted guest. The irony was sharp enough to cut. The very family that was supposed to be my safety net had woven a spectacle instead. Watching them in their whirlwind of excitement, I felt the burn of disbelief. Seriously, guys? You traded my future for speeches and waltzes? Early signs of the problem. I, the naive fool, still clung to the belief in miracles. You know, those movie moments where parents have a revelation, suddenly realizing their mistakes, rushing to embrace the overlooked main character, and everything ends with tears of joy and swelling orchestral music. Those scenes played in a loop in my head, every night a repeat performance, as I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow, they'll get it. They have to." But tomorrow came, again and again, and the miracle never arrived. Instead, my mother's expression would shift from distracted concern to an impatient frown, her words cutting through the silence like ice shards. "Jason, your brother deserves a celebration. You have to understand." The sting was deeper than I'd expected. Oh, I understood, Mom. I understood that in the story of our family, I was the character left out of the spotlight, holding the worst hand in a rigged game. Her words were more than a dismissal. They were the hammer nailing down any last illusions I had. That was when I started to spiral. watching my life unravel, thread by thread. Losing my job? It was almost predictable. The day it happened, my boss, a man with a perpetually furrowed brow and a voice like a creaky door hinge, looked at me as if I'd asked him to fund a yacht vacation. "We need healthy employees, Jason. You understand, right?" He didn't even try to mask the pity in his tone. Sure, I understood. The creditors were relentless, calling with a frequency that rivaled telemarketers during dinner time. Their voices blended into one accusatory blur, and the pressure settled into my bones, a constant weight I couldn't shake. Exhaustion wrapped itself around me like an old, scratchy blanket that reeked of defeat. Every day, I'd stare into the bathroom mirror, hoping for some semblance of recognition, but all I saw was someone hollowed out, eyes dulled by disappointment and fatigue. I traced the bags under my eyes, wondering if they'd ever go away, or if they were permanent, carved into my face like a reminder of where I stood. Meanwhile, the house around me transformed into a scene out of a magazine spread for weddings of the century. Nick and his fiancée were a vision of bliss, their laughter ringing through the halls, punctuated by debates over trivial details that seemed to hold the gravity of world peace negotiations. "Roses or peonies, darling," Nick would say, and I'd hear my mother chime in with the enthusiasm of someone choosing the fate of a nation. My father, usually stoic, suddenly had an opinion on menu choices and seating arrangements, discussing canapés like they were a matter of life and death. It was champagne toasts, bursts of joy, affectionate pats on the back. And there I was, sitting alone in my room, surrounded by silence, the sounds of celebration muffled but ever present. The walls closed in tighter each night, as if conspiring to crush what little hope I still clung to. I felt like a castaway, watching a ship of revelers sail away, leaving me clutching a splintered piece of wood in the vast indifferent sea conflict brewing. Then came the big day, Nick's wedding day, when the entire world seemed to orbit around him and his perfect, dazzling smile. I stood off to the side, almost camouflaged by the hedges in the shadows, a silent witness to this festival of grandeur. My parents were beaming, their faces lit up as if illuminated from within, and Nick stood at the center, basking in the adoration that came so easily to him. His bride, radiant and picture-perfect, clutched his arm like the leading lady in some Hollywood epic. The guests fawned and dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, as if they were witnessing a royal wedding. Every detail was precise and shimmering with perfection. A sprawling white marquee that caught the sunlight like polished ivory, gold ribbons tied neatly around crystal champagne flutes, the kind of extravagance reserved for magazine spreads. The guests, clad in their finest, waved their programs in the summer heat, their exaggerated sighs and sniffles adding to the theatricality of it all. I felt like my chest was caving in, shrinking to the size of a shriveled pit as the day wore on. Each burst of laughter reverberated through me, the sound splintering through my body, as though those strings of tension inside me were being wound tighter and tighter, ready to snap. I clenched my fists until my nails dug into my palms, a sting that barely registered. Nick was resplendent, the epitome of joy and charm, his grin wide enough to reflect the adoration right back at the crowd. I wondered if that glimmer in his eyes was real, or just for show. "Your whole life is one big performance, isn't it?" I thought, bitterness coiling in my gut like a viper. When the formalities wound down and conversation softened, the clink of champagne glasses turned sour. I caught a snippet of dialogue that would change everything. My mother, cheeks flushed from joy and perhaps a little too much wine, leaned into an aunt and said with a dismissive shrug, "Jason's always been so spineless." She said it as though it were the simplest truth in the world, a fact that required no embellishment. The words sliced through me, raw and shocking, like a slap in the face. It felt like a current of electricity jolted through my veins, setting every nerve on fire. All those years I'd stood there, absorbing the subtle digs and overt slights, convincing myself that this was just what family was. Messy, imperfect, but ultimately yours. I swallowed the resentment, told myself, you deal with it because they're your blood. But in that moment, surrounded by glittering laughter and swirling champagne, something broke inside me. It wasn't a clean snap. It was a jagged, tearing realization that I couldn't go back to being that silent shadow. I couldn't keep being the overlooked, the expendable, the one who was never seen, except as a fleeting punchline or an obligatory afterthought. That was it, my breaking point, and it was burning through me with the fury of a lifetime of silence, finally turned to flame, escalating the conflict. I began pulling away from my family, step by step, as if someone had rewound the film of our lives and I was fading from their story, frame by frame. Calls from my parents lit up my phone screen, only to be left unanswered, while texts buzzed and blinked, ignored until they disappeared into the void of unread messages. The illness was relentless, gnawing at my strength day by day, but there was no chance I'd let it drag me under entirely. If help didn't come from those who should have offered it, it came instead from friends who defined loyalty not by blood, but by action. Charitable organizations, whose office spaces smelled of cheap coffee and echoed with weary sighs, became my sanctuary. These places, run by people with tired eyes and hearts too big for their bodies, extended lifelines during those moments when hope felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. While I pieced my life back together with duct tape and borrowed hope, Nick's flawless world began to unravel like a badly told fairy tale. What glittered on social media, the radiant smiles, the exotic vacations, the extravagant dinners, started to fray at the edges as reality closed in. The lavish lifestyle that looked picture perfect came with a price tag too steep to maintain. Debt grew like a storm cloud, dark and inevitable, shadowing their every move and turning their grand parties into tense soirees where the clinking of glasses masked whispered worries. My parents, who once basked in the glow of Nick's seemingly boundless success, suddenly found themselves scrambling. They had been at the pinnacle, arms wide as they proclaimed, "Our Nick is the best." But now, with bills stacking higher than their pride, they were selling anything that could fetch a price. I half-jokingly mused that if they owned a golden toilet, it'd be the first thing to go. The joke didn't feel as sharp when, one day, I overheard my mom talking to the neighbor with a voice that sounded more defeated than I'd ever imagined. We just didn't expect such hardships. "Oh, really, Mom? You didn't see this coming?" Maybe foreseeing this was as difficult as ignoring my hoarse, blood-streaked coughs that echoed down the hall on lonely weekends. The irony was thick, almost laughably so. As they poured themselves into saving Nick's image, their carefully curated facade began to splinter. Their polished family portrait, the one they displayed with pride and held up as proof of their perfect life, cracked visibly. Neighbors, once envious and eager for invites, now whispered with pity behind cupped hands. The tragic comedy unfolded for everyone to see, where the distinction between tears of frustration and bitter laughter became so blurred that even they probably couldn't tell which was which. Deeper into the problem, my parents started begging me for help, and it was a sight worth charging admission for. Seeing them, once so proud and now broken, pleading for support they'd so easily denied me, was like watching an upside-down world unfold. They came with faces full of regret, but even then couldn't quite shake their cursed pride. Their apologies sounded like poorly rehearsed lines from a cheap drama, with every syllable ringing of desperation rather than sincerity. Then came the call from my father. The man who had always looked at me like I was nothing more than background noise now seemed ready to eat his tie out of shame. His voice shook like a schoolboy caught cheating on an exam. "Jason, we messed up, but you're our son." Oh, how touching, I thought. After all these years, he finally remembered he had another son besides Nick. I held the phone as if it were a grenade, memories replaying like a greatest hits playlist of pain. The times I sat outside their door, arms crossed, silently pleading with my eyes while they turned away, treating me like a commercial break in their Nick's success show. My brain played these scenes like a loop of the most gut-wrenching songs. Every denial, every whispered judgment, every time my mom told me I was a failure and needed to accept it. I set the phone on the table and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in a long time, I felt stronger than them. Climax. Nick ended up in a mess that made even the most outrageous Hollywood thrillers look like tame bedtime stories. A fraud scandal surfaced out of nowhere, and our shiny golden boy now stood on the brink of a courtroom drama. The irony was thick. After years of being the untouchable hero, he was becoming the villain in his own tale. My parents panicked, as if facing the apocalypse, and even I found it strange to watch. My mother dashed around the room, flinging accusations like, "How did we miss this?" My father stood silent, his face taut, looking like every line etched into it was about to split apart. When I entered their house, the silence rang out. It felt as if the marble floor, where Nick once posed in expensive shoes, now absorbed the bitter reality. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with wry detachment. My father, whose face had always been like armor, did something unimaginable. He dropped to his knees in front of me. Yes, that father who believed tears were for the weak, and who saw me as an unworthy part of the family, was now begging for my help. His voice cracked, stripped of its intimidating power. "Jason, we don't know what to do. Help us." This was a moment burned into my memory like a harsh engraving. I stood in the shadows, watching them, these once proud titans, break. My thoughts raced. How could they ask for forgiveness when my cries for help had gone unheard for so long? They'd always seen me as second-rate, the insignificant character in the backdrop of Nick's star-studded show. My fingers twitched, but I kept my expression stone-cold as I looked at my father, now humbled and shattered. Part of me felt satisfaction at watching their world crumble like a house of cards, but another part knew this was a moment of decision. Would they deserve the help only I could offer? Pollution. Instead of basking in vengeful triumph, I chose to show that I was above all this. I offered to help them, but with one condition. Not a dime of money, not 1 cent. Only my emotional support and knowledge to help them navigate this ordeal and support Nick in court. Even I couldn't believe I was stepping into this role, but apparently there was still a tiny hero inside me willing to come out. When I said this out loud, my parents' faces were an open book, humiliated, empty, but with a flicker of hope. Seconds stretched before my mom forced out, "You'd really do that?" Oh, how I wanted to say, "No, I'm just practicing my role as the magnanimous brother." But instead, I nodded and replied, "Yes, but don't think for a second that I've forgotten everything." Their expressions slowly changed, as if someone had finally hit the reset button, showing them that the world wasn't just a shiny poster with Nick front and center. My father looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something I'd never seen in his eyes. Respect. Finally, I thought, the old man figured out that his second-rate son had a backbone they hadn't expected. He reached out a hand, but I just nodded, maintaining the distance. Let them feel that support doesn't mean forgiveness or returning to the old ways. As we discussed the case and the steps to take, I watched them gradually realize that my help wasn't just words, but a testament to my resilience, despite their treatment. And that broke them more than any financial crisis. Epilogue. Nick got away with a suspended sentence because, of course, the family's golden boy always lands on his feet. The judge must have decided that Nick's charm and dazzling smile outweighed his real offenses. My parents breathed a sigh of relief, but only for a short while. Their financial ship, which they'd so confidently steered through seas of debt and luxury, finally sank. A few months later, they lost their house, the very one where I'd always been just a backdrop to their perfect life. I packed my bags and moved to the middle of nowhere, another state where nobody knew me, and I could just be me without the constant feeling of being a shadow of a more successful brother. There, I met new people who didn't compare me to the great and almighty Nick. These people saw me not as the pitiful kid always fed the scraps of attention, but as someone with character and stories that made for great late-night talks over beers. Sometimes, at night, when silence filled my small apartment, I'd think about how everything turned out. Pride and blind devotion to one child had turned our family into remnants of former glory. It was a tragicomedy, to call it by its name. I'd imagine my parents, sitting in a dingy rented place, flipping through old albums of Nick's wedding and his kids, while reality squeezed them like a vice. And you know what? I felt a sense of satisfaction. Not the vengeful kind of ha-ha serves you right, but more an understanding that everything in life has consequences. Their world was falling apart, and I watched from the sidelines, knowing I had come out of this stronger than I ever thought possible.